But I just want to welcome everyone today to the United Nations. My name is Vanessa O'Brien. I'm one of the co-chairs of the annual dinner this weekend. To my left is Alexandra Shackleton. She's come from London, England to be here, and I'm very grateful for her taking that trip to help celebrate the centenary of her grandfather, Sir Ernest, who was a member of the Explorers Club. She's going to introduce, set the stage for what Tim Jarvis did. And Tim is an incredible explorer, a scientist, and a conservationist who recreated the Endurance voyage in 2013. And I think what you're about to see and hear will just amaze you. If I can now have you welcome Alexandra Shackleton.
Thank you, and many thanks to the Explorers Club for inviting me not only here, which is a wonderful experience in itself, but to the 111th dinner tonight. I'm here to set the scene for Tim Jarvis's expedition talk. I'm a very proud patron, and that is a great pleasure. So I'm now going to take you back nearly 100 years to 1916, which is when the Ernest Shackleton's Endurance expedition was in trouble. The ship Endurance was crushed in the ice. Nobody, of course, knew where they were. Ernest Shackleton got him and his 27 men to Elephant Island, a deeply disagreeable rocky island sticking up out of the ocean. I've been there. You wouldn't want to stay there. Looking at it was not fun. They got there, and there were plenty of penguins and seals, but Ernest Shackleton knew that they would migrate, and then food would be a serious issue. So he embarked on an immense gamble. The largest of the 3 lifeboats, the James Caird, he proposed to take on a voyage of 800 miles across the stormiest seas in the world to South Georgia, where help might be had. The James Caird was its name. It was not quite 23 foot. As a lifeboat, it had no keel. So Ernest Shackleton set forth what he described later as a voyage in heaving waters that at one stage they thought they would not make it, but they did. Life on board the James Caird was pretty uncomfortable. There were 6 men. Going below was described as like going into a coffin. Ernest Shackleton had to talk his men in. No, that's not your leg, that's his leg. And up on deck, the temperature was so harsh that at one stage the helmsman could not stand upright after his stint at the steering. He had to sort of be massaged to stand up. Food was difficult. They couldn't sit up or lie down. They were constantly soaked because the canvas decking let in the water. They developed giant saltwater blisters. The reindeer sleeping bags, the fur shed, the hairs got up in their nose and eyes and mouth, but they were nearing South Georgia. Luckily, the navigator, Worsley, New Zealander, was a genius, because it would have been very easy to miss this tiny speck in the ocean, South Georgia. Then the next stop would have been Africa. The James Caird was extremely uncomfortable to travel in, heavily ballasted, possibly over-ballasted. They felt every stone knew every bit of their bodies and stuck into them. Then one day, it was less uncomfortable than usual. Ernest Shackleton wrote, "We could not believe our luck." But then he realized what was happening. The James Caird was icing up. The extra weight would have sent her to the bottom. They had to lean out one at a time and chip the ice off with an old knife. No one could stand it for more than a few minutes. But they were on their way. Then Worsley, the navigator, only had 4 sightings of the sun in the whole voyage. But then the sky started to lighten. They thought last decent weather. Ernest Shackleton realized this was actually the crest of an enormous wave. He called his men to hang on, and this huge wave, they think of the size of a 3-story building, crashed down on this little cockle shell. They bailed like mad and bobbed up again. Then they were getting near South Georgia, and they started to suffer terribly from thirst. Their tongues were black and swollen. It was found that one of the barrels had been stoved in, and it was polluted with seawater. Then a storm arose, tantalizingly, in sight of South Georgia. They had to lay off or be dashed on the rocks. Worsley, the navigator, wrote, "I felt sadness that if we died here, no one would ever know we had actually accomplished the voyage." But the wind dropped and they made landfall, drank the best drink they had in their lives, a little icy stream. They were too weak even to pull up the boat properly. They moved the Caird to a more suitable cove and left her there. They couldn't take the boat around the island. She'd been pretty battered, and like all lifeboats that era, she had no keel. But that was only half the rescue. South Georgia was unmapped, uncharted. No one had ever penetrated the interior of the island. The mountains go up to 3,000 feet. None of them were climbers. Ernest Shackleton took Worsley and Crean. The carpenter put nails in their boots. They had a coil of rope, an axe head, and the primus. And they set off to climb. They were hoping to get to Stromness, which was the nearest whaling station. Norwegian, they were all Norwegian then. They set off. At one stage, they got seriously lost and had to go back again. In their exhausted state, it was pretty galling. Worsley and Crean, at one stage, said, "We have to sleep." So Ernest Shackleton gave them 5 minutes and told them they had half an hour. Later on, they were very high up. Ernest Shackleton was unhappy with their position. He said, I don't like it. We might freeze here. So he took another gamble. He did take gambles, but always controlled gambles. They sat one behind another on the coil of rope and slid off into the darkness. It could have been over a precipice, but they saved a lot of time. Then, at last, they were in a position when, if they were in the right place, they would hear the early morning whistle calling the whalers to work, a sound that would make the difference between life and death, not only for them, the men on the other side of the island from the boat, who had not been fit enough to accompany them, and the men on Elephant Island. So they waited what must have seemed a very long quarter of an hour, and then they heard what Ernest Shackleton described as the sweetest music human ear ever heard. It was the whistle. They staggered down. They had to negotiate a 300-foot waterfall, and they felt unreasonably, after all they'd been through, it's a bit hard to be soaked yet again. They went into Stromness whaling station. 3 filthy, ragged, smelly, black-faced figures, black-faced on the blubber stove. Dogs barked, children ran away. Ernest Shackleton asked to be taken to the manager's villa. He knew him quite well. The manager came out and said, "Who the hell are you?" So Ernest Shackleton said, "Don't you know me?" And the manager said, "I think I know your voice. You're the mate from the Daisy." And Ernest Shackleton said, "My name is Shackleton." There is one story that the manager turned away and wept. Everyone thought they were dead. So then the manager, immensely hospitable, retrieved the men from the island, and some of the whalers asked to meet them that evening when they had retrieved the boat. And they said, "I and my compatriots," this old whaler said, "have never heard of such a feat as taking this tiny, not quite 23-foot boat, 800 miles across the stormiest seas of the world, and then climbing unclimbed South Georgia. These are men," he said. And then on the 4th attempt, Ernest Shackleton rescued his men from Elephant Island. So that is the story of the Shackleton rescue. Thank you.
And thank you to the Explorers Club for inviting me along with the United Nations, and of course to Sven Lindblad and his organisation, Lindblad Expeditions. Without plugging them too overtly, a wonderful firm that engage in both exploration and sustainability in roughly equal amounts. So I'm very proud to have an association. I thought what we would quickly do is my assistant here will show you a brief clip of a minute just to tell you a little bit about what it was like.
Shackleton are in the middle of a storm. Winds are over 50 knots, and the waves are as high as 5 meters.
This is the worst conditions we've experienced so far.
The team has sailed 200 miles from Elephant Island and still has 600 miles to go to South Georgia. They're reliving Shackleton's nightmare. So small was our boat and so great were the seas that often our sail flapped idly in the calm between the crests of 2 waves. Then we would climb the next slope and catch the full fury of the gale, where the wool-like whiteness of the breaking water surged around us.
Every time.
Everything ends up absolutely sodden.
It is one hellish journey. I can't feel any of my fingers.
Well, there we are, just trying to give you some insight as to what it was like to retrace the journey of Sir Ernest Shackleton in a replica of his boat across the stormy Southern Ocean, followed by a climb through the mountains of South Georgia. Alexandra has very capably set the scene as to what the original was like, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking you through what it's like 100 years on to try and replicate this journey and do so with a degree of authenticity that does justice to the original. No point doing it cheating by taking a modern vessel and having Gore-Tex and neoprene layers and EPIRBs and life jackets and that kind of thing, but done really the old way to honour the original journey. I must admit it's a little bit disconcerting speaking with someone sitting with the nameplate Tim Jarvis being a very attractive blonde lady there, but I'll try and push through. I think Alexandra has really set the scene as to what the original journey was, but just by way of a little bit of a recap, it was to try and cross Antarctica from one side to the other. And this is a distance of 2,700 kilometers, about 1,800 miles, going from one side to the other on foot. Because Antarctica is such a massive place, it's about twice the size of the lower 48, about twice the size of Australia, where I currently live. It's 58 times the size of the UK, and I was speaking in Hong Kong recently, and they were shocked to discover that it's 12,000 times the size of Hong Kong. And I think the only thing that gave them some solace is the fact that it's 20,000 times the size of Singapore, who are one of their main rivals, so that gave them some solace. But to give you an idea, I am an environmental scientist of some of the scale of what you're dealing with down there. These are my tracks from my bid to cross Antarctica on foot back in 1999, and this shot is taken about 350 miles from the South Pole itself. In the background is a mountain almost 11,000 feet high, but only the top 400 feet sticks out of the ice. The other 10,500 feet is buried in the ice that, of course, is even thicker in some parts of Antarctica. You've got ice almost 15,000 feet thick. And between where I took this shot and the South Pole itself, there are, of course, many more mountains, just that none are physically big enough to poke through the ice of Antarctica, and you're walking quite literally over the summits of those mountains, which is an incredible thing. If you're a mountaineer like me, it does give you a great opportunity to get up peaks very easily. You've only got to do the last 20 feet and you can bag a 15,000-foot mountain. But anyway, from an environmental science point of view, and I'm not going to labour the point, but there is a tremendous amount of water locked up in the Antarctic ice cap. You've got 97% of the world's water in the ocean. The remaining 3%, 2%, is in the Antarctic ice cap. And in fact, 7 billion of us survive on 1%, of which about a quarter, if I'm not mistaken, is in Lake Baikal in Russia. So in fact, we survive on 3/4 of 1% of the world's available water, which is why we're always fighting over water. It's one of the biggest sources of conflict in the world. Shackleton's goal, anyway, was to cross this from one side to the other, in so doing eclipsing what Scott and Amundsen had done by reaching the pole itself. He wanted to go all the way across, and of course the South Geographic Pole is roughly halfway. As we've heard, things didn't quite go according to plan. Shackleton went down south to the Weddell Sea, the Atlantic side of Antarctica, in his ship Endurance. He sent Douglas Mawson, the polar explorer from another contemporary from the heroic era, his ship down to the other side, to the Ross Sea side, the McMurdo side of Antarctica. And 2 teams of men travelled on those 2 separate ships. Their goal was to put out food caches in the direction of the pole from either side that Shackleton would access in his bid to cross Antarctica from one side to the other. Everything went wrong with the loss of endurance. Initially, she was trapped in the pack ice that was unseasonably thick that particular year. In fact, almost 100 years ago, about a month back, she first became trapped in the ice, end of January in 1915. And it was November of 1915 when these immense forces of pack ice finally squeezed all the life out of her, and down she went in what we believe is around 10,000 feet of water. And who knows whether there will be efforts to go and find her. It'll be very interesting to see as we approach the 100th anniversary. Shackleton is now taught at many of the world's leading management schools, Wharton, Yale, Harvard here, and of course Cambridge in the UK, and many others, INSEAD in Paris, for his ability to lead. And he did this by instilling a sense of confidence that hope was not lost and setting out a route map as to how he proposed to rescue his men from, frankly, what was a completely hopeless situation. As Alexandra said, nobody knew they were there. They were living on top of pack ice, on the top of a very deep, very inhospitable ocean. They had, frankly, no hope of rescue. But Shackleton refused to be cowed by this and went about the process of getting all of his men home alive, which indeed he did. And that's one of the reasons for which he is so famous. He said, when Endurance finally sank below the waves, he said, "Men, today we'll go home." And he said it with a degree of confidence that, frankly, he had no real right to use, but he did so with such confidence that it really instilled in all the men the belief that they could really rescue themselves. They really could do it. They could save themselves from this awful, awful predicament. When the ice finally released them, a long time later, over a year later, the men had been living in whatever they could get off the Endurance before she sank, which included the 3 lifeboats. These are 22, 23-foot whalers. So historically, 6 or 8 men would be in one of these boats. They'd be rowed. You would harpoon a whale with a rope attached to it from one of these vessels. That rope would be tied around perhaps the stern post of the boat, and the men would row the whale into submission up on the beach and then flens it, chop it up and render down the blubber. They arrived, the pack ice having broken up, at Elephant Island after a horrific time living out on the ice, and they fell ashore, and it was the first time they'd actually reached terra firma for getting on for a year and a half. It was a long, long time they'd been out there. And again, testament to Shackleton's leadership that everybody kept things together. But Shackleton knew immediately that there was obviously the euphoria of falling ashore and reaching terra firma for the first time, but he knew that nobody was going to find them in Elephant Island either. This was quite literally only one step better than where they'd just come from. There is no human population on Elephant Island. There never has been right to this day. The whole island is very, very steep cliffs or glacial snouts. There is no viable water source apart from glacial ice melt, no vegetation of any kind, certainly no people. And so Shackleton knew that he'd have to get back in one of these boats in order to effect some kind of rescue. The only option, given the currents that come around the bottom of South America from the Pacific into the Atlantic, 3 times the volume of the Gulf Stream, these flow out. There's no way known you can sail. Most vessels find it incredibly difficult to sail upwind into those sorts of currents and winds, but in a boat with no keel, being the vertical that goes down into the water from the base of your boat, I'm sure you can appreciate it's very difficult to sail into the wind and into the current. And you can try if you like, but you'd be pushed back up into the southern Atlantic. So Shackleton knew his only possible destination was going to be South Georgia, where there were whaling stations, about 800 nautical miles to the northeast of where they were. The only vessel they were going to be able to do this in was the most seaworthy of the 3 lifeboats, a boat called the James Caird. So planks were taken from the other vessels, a makeshift deck was made, and Shackleton, together with the 5 best men, got in this vessel to undertake, frankly, a near-suicidal mission, but one that had to be undertaken. Shackleton actually took the 5 best men. In fact, upon closer examination, you realise he probably took the 3 best and the 2 biggest troublemakers. He didn't want to leave them behind to erode away the morale of the men left behind. And there's a very, very important point. I think he was always thinking of the bigger picture. What would happen if he left those 2 behind to erode away the morale of the 22 who remained behind on Elephant Island? Arguably as difficult a task as heading off across the ocean in the small boat. And he sailed this successfully, together with his crew, to South Georgia, against all the odds. They arrived, having come from the south, on the southern side. Of course, all the whaling stations sensibly are on the northern, sheltered side of the island, in between massive mountain range. Never been climbed, no maps. The whalers had no cause to go into those mountains. They didn't know what was there. They just knew they were very inhospitable, very steep. And so Shackleton, arriving on the southern side, found that 3 of his men were incapacitated through the journey they'd just undertaken, the extreme cold of the journey. And so he and 2 men, Worsley and Crean, undertook the first ever crossing of those mountains. They had no equipment. They had 1 section of rope. They had leather boots with screws and nails pushed through the soles for grip. They had 1 carpenter's adze for their climbing equipment. A carpenter's adze is like a pickaxe with a flat blade. They had no tent, so they couldn't stop. As anybody here will appreciate who's done polar expeditions, and I note a number of esteemed people in the audience, you will realize that you have to keep moving to generate heat in a polar trekking situation. Too much, you sweat, that becomes a problem. Too little, and you freeze to death. So you have to keep moving. Shackleton had no tent. He had to keep moving to make this crossing of the island, and they did, arriving at Stromness whaling station, as we've said, against all the odds, with that tearful reunion on the part of the Norwegian whaling station manager. A truly remarkable, remarkable journey. How do you make a recreation of something like this a reality? This had always been a big one out there for me. I've done polar expeditions for years, but I've always done them traditionally in modern gear, Gore-Tex and satellite phones and Kevlar sleds and that sort of stuff. I've done one other expedition the old way, which was to retrace the journey of Sir Douglas Mawson, the Australian contemporary of Shackleton's. And his was a journey where both colleagues died, and Mawson was left in a starvation situation. So I starved myself to the same extent as Mawson, to see if I could do it without the need to eat the other guy, which has always been the claim made by many as to how Mawson had made that journey a success. It was a journey where I lost 70 pounds. It was not pleasant, but it was doable. And on that basis, I'm prepared to pin my colours to the mast and say Mawson didn't eat Mertz, who died in his arms in the tent. But on that basis, and through our friendship developed over many years, Alexandra Shackleton asked me if I would be prepared to assemble a team to retrace her famous grandfather's journey. I found myself saying yes immediately. I think with all considerable respect, when Alexandra asks you to do something, she's really asking you rhetorically and suggesting you will do it. And so I found myself saying yes immediately. But there were many moments, I have to admit, where I was very fearful in the middle of the night when your problems loom large, considering the prospect of a journey in a small boat across the Southern Ocean, done the same way as Shackleton. But persevere we did. By endurance we conquer, as Shackleton said. And I began the process that was almost 5 years of planning to make this expedition a reality. How do you make it happen? There are many ways to answer that question. Suffice to say, it requires sponsorship. To get corporate sponsors to commit, you have to offer them some means by which you're going to give them recognition for their involvement. Best way to do that is to make a film. Trouble is, a reputable broadcaster will not commit until you have the corporate sponsorship, and the corporate sponsors won't commit until they know you have the film deal sewn up, and the publisher of the book that hopefully will happen won't commit until the film deal and the corporate sponsorship are committed, and the team you need to make the thing happen, the caliber of the people you need to get committed, will not commit until you have the film deal, the book deal, and the sponsorship. In the meantime, the 5 sets of yellow pages, the phone directory size permitting requirements you need to get done can't be completed until you have all of that in position. I'm sure many people here have been in this position, but suffice to say, the only way to break the deadlock is to back yourself. And I put my house on the line. My wife sort of understood, I think, and off we went. And we began the process of trying to make that a reality. And of course, we're very pleased to have had Discovery Channel and PBS as our broadcast partners on the expedition. Before I go forward, I might just draw your attention to the fact that on that previous picture, that shot is taken at Point Wild on Elephant Island. That's me in the old gear. And I might just draw your attention to the the headland in the background there. Perhaps you can see it. There's a headland and an island with a couple of small hummocks on it. And perhaps if you look carefully, albeit snow-covered, you've got the same little hummocky mountain, and there's the headland in the background. If I just go forward one, you can see there it is again, and we're assuming the James Caird was put in about 20 yards behind where I'm standing there. Me getting there in the first place was thanks to Rob McCallum, who's sitting at the front here, and the people of EOS Expeditions and the world, in fact, to get me there to get that opportunity. The how also involves having the right team. Shackleton allegedly, or probably apocryphally, said he wanted men for a hazardous journey with safe return doubtful, and long hours of recognition, long hours of hardship, recognition in case of success, but safe return doubtful, allegedly. I think that's an apocryphal advert. He was looking for 27 people to man his bigger ship, the Endurance. He got 2,000 applicants. I was only after 5 people to get in my equivalent of the James Caird, called the Alexandra Shackleton. And I got about 200 applicants for that. All manner of different people. I had young schoolgirls all the way through to emeritus professors and everything in between wanting to take part. But the team that we ultimately selected were the guys up on screen, and I'll briefly talk to who they are. I'm at the back. Next one along in the white hat is a guy called Nick Bubb. Nick Bubb came recommended to me by someone called Pete Goss. Pete won the Legion of Honor from the French government for turning around in the single-handed round-the-world race and rescuing a demasted competitor, in so doing sacrificing his chances in the race. And he said, "You need Nick." And I eagerly anticipated meeting Nick. And Nick and I got together, and I said, "Look, here's the plan, here's the dream, here's the vision." And Nick said, "I love the dream, I love the vision, but I think some of the thinking is flawed. And I think we're going to sort of die out on the Southern Ocean based on doing it the way you're talking about doing it. But I think if we can talk this through, and you're prepared to listen to me as skipper of this vessel, which is what I was proposing to make him, then I'd be happy to be involved. We can really work together, much as Worsley and Shackleton had done 100 years prior." And I said, "I'm very happy to do that." And frankly, I encouraged this kind of approach in my team. Everybody had to be able to speak their mind. I didn't want people coming up with problems unless they were also prepared to offer a solution. I wanted pragmatic optimists in the team, and that was the guiding principle by which everybody became involved. The next guy along in the beige hat is someone called Paul Larson. He has 7 world records. He's an Aussie. He is the fastest sailor in the world, 64.5 knots in a sailboat, if you can imagine that. And I said to him, "Well, look, you know, the average speed of our vessel will be considerably slower, about 62 knots slower. But if you're still interested, 64 occasionally going down the waves, but not under normal circumstances." And he was really happy to be involved. He knew Nick extremely well, and they worked extremely well as a pair. The next one along, Seb Coulthard, fixes helicopters for the Royal Navy, the Fleet Air Arm, as they're called in the UK. And people said, why take him? Well, the answer is we needed to come back with a film, a movie about this, documentary for Discovery Channel. So rather than take 1,000 kilograms of rocks, 2 and a bit thousand pounds of rocks off the beach of Elephant Island to try and prevent this boat capsizing, we used some rocks and some camera batteries to give us our ballast to the equivalent weight. Both equally uncomfortable, because we took the combination to sleep on, I can tell you, and equally bad, I suspect, if they fall on your head with the boat upside down. But his role was to make that so. His ability to take a helicopter that's been in one theatre of combat, make it ready for another one with 48 hours notice, is the same sort of skill set I needed to project manage the retrofit of our little original James Caird replica to make it fit for actually filming this show. This was not an exercise where you're watching a mountaineer out there and someone's there behind the camera filming them. We filmed ourselves via 6 fixed cameras that were powered by that bank of batteries that we slept on. The next guy is Barry Gray, second from the front. He is the head of outdoor survival for the UK Armed Forces. Regimental Sergeant Major for the Royal Marines Regiment, the elite regiment. He claimed to have a sense of humour. No one disputed it, obviously. He was our cook. He was absolutely dreadful. Again, no one disputed that either. He cooked up the stuff that we ate very much as Shackleton did. They ate pemmican as the staple, congealed animal fat, essentially lard, the sort of stuff you scrape out of the frying pan if you haven't done the washing up after a fried meal, that artery congealing stuff. I always maintain the heroic era could have been so called purely on the basis of men's ability to eat the food, let alone anything else. Horrible stuff. When you are feeling or have been extremely sick, probably on your colleague who's sitting next to you, given the proximity in which we lived, and then somebody passes you a metal tinned mug with a semi-congealed substance in it that wobbles with its own cadence. It is extremely difficult. You only want to be left alone to either die or maybe have some dry white toast or something like that. They pass you a cup of lard. It is difficult to get that down, to keep yourself going. But you must do, because obviously you need to keep your energy levels up. And the chap at the front, Ed Wardle, he's a cameraman, but he's summited Everest twice, and he's the UK's former free diving champion. So hold your breath, dive as deep as you can. In fact, he's going to accompany Vanessa to K2 in 3 or 4 months' time. A great guy. We knew he'd survive, if no one else, based on his ability to hold his breath underwater. But we needed someone to come back with a story. But I could talk at great length about leadership and teamwork and everything else, but suffice to say, they were a team who were better than me. And I think you need to recruit people who are as good or not, if not better than you, in order to get something of the enormity of this journey to take place and do justice to it. Our boat, called the Alexandra Shackleton, was a copy of the original. We did put those planks in, by the way, at the bottom. I am no sailor, but I know that much. And, you know, the boat, in the 5 years of planning, we made it in the first year and a half. Not because we needed it then, but because when you're planning something and you have millions of dollars and lots of expectation and a team who need to keep their morale up, you need to see tangible evidence of something happening. It's no good putting money in the expedition coffers, if that happens, and improving your risk assessment and doing your training and all that good stuff. You need to see the boat come together. So we built the boat early so that people got confidence in the fact we were actually going to do this, even though it was a small part of a much, much bigger budget. Humans need to see tangible evidence of change. It's why polar expeditioning is often so difficult, because you're traveling towards an endless white horizon, and you toil away all day, and there's no visible change to the outlook the next day or the next day or the next day or for 65 days thereafter. And you need to work out how to deal with that. The finished product was our boat named after our good patron here, Alexandra Shackleton. We ran a risk assessment on the things that we felt could go wrong in this expedition, and we had 171 line items in our little spreadsheet, not so little spreadsheet. Everything from, you know, hitting a whale, fire, sickness, physical injury, being run over by another vessel is a big risk. You have tankers with a crew of 6, 200,000 tons, autopilot. They'd turn you to driftwood without even realizing they'd done so. So these are all very real risks, particularly when you're in a vessel when you only have about 15 inches of freeboard between the surface of the sea and the deck of your boat. You're all wearing drab clothes, you have no lights. You know, these are serious considerations. The worst risk was capsize. In the event of capsize, somebody's not coming home. Because essentially, if you're on deck without any guy lines or anything to hold you in, or a life jacket, in a storm situation, we steered by pulling ropes. There's no tiller. A tiller gives you mechanical advantage. Shackleton didn't have that, so we didn't. If you fall overboard in that situation, the men in the upturned boat are not going to be in a position to do anything for you. This storm, you could conceivably have waves from peak to trough the height of the ceiling in here. You know, those men have got a very limited survival time in 2 degrees Celsius seawater. Very, very low. That's low 30s Fahrenheit. About 10 minutes, to be precise. When you're wearing woolens, cotton, Burberry outers, and leather boots. We know that because we tested it, not to complete failure, but a couple of candidates I wouldn't have minded putting in there and seeing how long they lasted. But amongst our team, we jumped into water in a place called the Cold Water Immersion Laboratory in the south of England. And they turn the temperature down as low as you want to go. And we knew how long we could last treading water wearing that clothing. And it's about 10 minutes. Quite simply because you then start to lose the ability to tread water. Your muscles lock up. And if you can't keep kicking, down you go. So our biggest fear was capsize. And those guys on the helm in the water. In the event that happened, how do you get the boat back upright with a view to trying to save them? Very, very difficult. This boat weighed 3 tons with the rocks, the batteries, a lot of water in there, us. The only thing we could do, the only thing that worked in our drills was to deliberately flood it. So the boat's upside down, the deck's facing down, you're in a storm, it's nighttime, 2 guys have gone overboard, they may be dead already, you're in complete darkness. What do? You open the air vents on the deck, which is now facing down, and you let in around 400 litres of water. Black, dark, Southern Ocean seawater. The idea being that when the next big wave picks you up, that water slops over to one side, and you use the weight of that to go the same way with the men, and you hope the combined weight of men and water is enough to make the boat pop back up. Then you're scouring the sea to see if the guys who don't have life jackets on, in their drab-coloured clothing, are still alive. So the prospects were extremely poor, which is why you're very focused on not going over in the Southern Ocean in your boat. What was it like out there? We cast off from Elephant Island. We landed at Point Wild, where Shackleton had his camp. We landed on a day when we had southerly winds, and the mountains of Elephant Island allowed us to land on the northern side. It was complete dead calm on the northern side, uncharacteristically. We set off from there, and almost immediately a massive iceberg appeared in front of us. Fine during daylight hours, but at night, you're going blind into something that's 2 miles wide. And this occupies, it's like Lower Manhattan, this thing is occupying a huge bit of the space that you need to be going to. I was on the helm. I thought I'll go downwind, it's a bit faster. Nick Bubb quickly appeared and said, for God's sake, don't do that. Keep upwind. If you go downwind, you've got the whole of that berg blocking out the wind. We're motionless. The berg will just run us over, or we'll drift back into it. So those sorts of decisions, that steep learning curve was happening right from the outset. Shortly thereafter, we had our first storm. We had 55 knots of wind. We had a couple of little concessions to modernity. We had an anemometer that allowed us to measure wind speed. And you've got this little boat right over on its side. The mast would routinely, like a metronome, touch one side of the sea, then the other side, then the other side, then the other side. In terms of freeboard, 16, 18 inches between the surface of the sea and the top of the boat. One man's job was to bail continuously with a bucket, and we also had a brass bailing pump. Seb Coulthard, one of the guys on the boat, he said, a definition of a pump is a man working to save his life with a bucket, something along those lines. And he was right. Somebody was constantly bailing. That was their job, to bail. Person standing on the helm is standing in about knee-deep, 2 degrees Celsius seawater with no sensation in the feet. You manage an hour, you get below, you spoon with the other guys, which should have been in the risk assessment. But anyway. And you do that just to get warm. You have no other means of really warming yourself up. You have one kerosene stove, propped between Barry Gray's legs in a rocking sea, very dangerous to use. And then it's your turn. Before you know it, it's your turn again to be back up on deck. You are mildly hypothermic the whole time, particularly towards the end of your shift, particularly wearing clothing that is not waterproof. Shackleton had not intended to do a small boat journey. He'd intended to cross the driest, windiest continent in the world, where breathability of your fabrics is important, not get in a small, frankly pretty unseaworthy boat and cross with being routinely doused with very cold seawater. Your space below deck was about the size of your family kitchen table. There got 6 of us, some of them my size, living in that space. 4 feet, 6 guys sitting opposite one another under this tiny space, 5 because one guy's on the deck. In that space, you are being physically sick, you are trying to navigate, you are trying to sleep when circumstances permit, you are trying to eat, you are trying to cook with a kerosene stove with the flame licking all over the place and fumes and and fuel pouring out. You've got the reindeer skin sleeping bags completely sopping wet from the water in the bilges of this boat. It was a very unpleasant set of circumstances. When nature calls and it's your turn, the bucket is produced. Everyone laughs until it's their turn to hold it. And it's you perching precariously over it in a storm. It's not fun, living below deck on that boat. Everybody was sick. Very, very challenging conditions in which to try and live. Even the eternally optimistic Paul Larsen, very experienced sailor, found it extremely challenging conditions. This clothing is completely inadequate for the job that you're putting it through, living out on the boat. The only thing you can do is break down the enormity of these challenges into manageable pieces by working through tiny little increments. Your time on deck, you get below as quickly as you can into this fetid, dark, wet environment below, and you just curl up with the other people and hope you can get some kind of sleep, all the while listening to the sound of the Southern Ocean through 15 millimeters of larch planking of this little boat with leaks and water coming through. It's very, very challenging, particularly for a non-sailor like me, who's had to learn the hard way how to do this and live aboard the boat. We too saw the sun only 4 times. Worsley on the original expedition had called the Southern Ocean the Great Grey Shroud. That's how he described it. And having done this, I can really identify with him. We saw the sun twice at noon, in other words, where the sun is at its highest point where you are, which enables you to take what they call a noonday sight. And they are the easiest ones to take when you're using a sextant, because that's what we used. We held on to Paul Larsen's legs, and he balanced precariously on the deck of the boat with a sextant, rolling around, trying to get an accurate view of the edge of the disk of the sun in which to get a bearing. He relayed that information down. We had a chronometer, so an old clock, sits on a gimbal so that the little pendulum inside can work even in rough sea, theoretically. And we sat there. It took all 6 of us to do these calculations. We only had 2 reliable sun sights the whole time. The rest of the time was all about dead reckoning. In other words, making a judgment about which way you're headed and how fast. And we practiced that for 6 months before going, trying to understand exactly how fast we were going and what direction we were going. I'm compressing this in the interest of time, but of course you can talk about this for forever. But we arrived at South Georgia, having survived 2 storms that, frankly, had they been any stronger, I just don't know what would have happened out there. It was really noisy, occasionally terrifying. You're on the helm of the boat as a non-sailor who's trained extensively for this, and you're going down the face of a large wave in a 3-ton boat with a tiny little rudder, just pulling the ropes either way, and you start to go off the perpendicular, you start to slew sideways, and you know that if it goes any further, the boat will be rolled over and somebody won't come home. So it's a very, very challenging environment in which to operate. We got to South Georgia after 2 weeks of enduring those conditions. The day we arrived, the problem was, having spent 5 years trying to think about how to reach this place, the problem with the day we arrived was the fact that we'd got there. Because the same winds and currents that had propelled you to South Georgia are now trying to push you straight on shore. It's what you call in sailing terms a lee shore. Wind, currents pushing you straight onto an island. You're in a boat with no keel. You don't just turn around and sail away. You're going in, regardless of what you do. You can go in forwards, or you can go in backwards, pretending you're sailing away, pointing at the wind, but all the while you're being pushed backwards. I never claim to have done what Shackleton did. We got as close as you can in the modern era, but one of the things I would say that was more difficult for us than it was for him was making the weather we got allow us to do his expedition. When we got to South Georgia, we would not have chosen to land where he did, but we had to replicate his journey. We had to land at King Haakon Bay, and we almost frankly ended up on the rocks. This shot is taken by a vessel that came down with 2 Discovery Channel cameramen to film us when we got to the mountains, by the way. Most of the other shots you see, and even the sequences in the film, are filmed really within a day or 2 of leaving Elephant Island and right at the end of the journey, not because there was any sort of boat alongside us out at sea. But they were particularly concerned. You can probably just see the little boat just over here. When we arrived, there wasn't really a sensation of elation. It was just relief that we got there. 3 of the guys' feet were in extremely bad condition. They weren't going anywhere. They couldn't feel their toes. They weren't going anywhere. We had to leave them on the beach. In the meantime, we were joined by our 2 friends from Discovery. I have to admit, just between you and me, that their job was not necessarily to try and encourage team unity. They were quite happy to see a little bit of dissension, and it's all good for the movie, right? So they got there and they were saying, look, you know, he said that, you said that, he said. There was a little bit of that going on. They were very nice guys, but that's their job. That's their job. So I wouldn't say that we welcomed seeing them particularly, but nevertheless, they were part of the project. And they were great partners, in fact, Discovery. So we were pinned down for 5 days with bad weather on the beach. Couldn't move. Gusting, very, very strong winds. We finally decided on the night of the 5th day, myself and Barry Gray, that it was time to leave regardless because of the conditions. We headed off up Shackleton Gap, which is the steep icy slope that leads you to the interior of South Georgia, with myself, Barry Gray, and Paul Larson. We'd lost Ed Wardle, one of the climbers with bad feet, and instead it was myself and Barry as climbers and Paul Larson, a sailor, and the 2 guys from Discovery Channel. 4 hours in, middle of the night, middle of a blizzard, we were still wearing very damp clothing. The first cameraman, drops to his haunches and said, you know, the pain in my back is too bad, I can't go on. Various motivational techniques were used to try and keep him going. A few words of kind encouragement, that kind of stuff. There was no having it. He was in too much pain. I don't doubt that he was. The boat that brought him in, I'd asked it to reposition itself on the northern side, at the one place you can get people out in the event there's a problem, before you start going into a whole world of glaciers and impossible terrain. Luckily, we were able to sit out a very cold, very unpleasant 85 knots of wind night that blew away the tent, and we were all huddled together trying to keep this guy warm with a view to him being evacuated in the morning. Dawn came, the other guy said, look, frankly, this wasn't what I signed up for either. Again, words were exchanged, and off they went down to the boat. So it was just 3 of us left. Interestingly, the expedition leader, the hard man of the expedition, that in the original was Tom Crean, that for us was Barry Gray, and the navigator, Worsley on the original, Paul Larson for us. We didn't try and contrive any of this. We ended up crossing South Georgia, or beginning the crossing, with exactly the same number of people and exactly the same roles as the original expedition. The point to which we evacuated those guys was the same spot to which Shackleton went by mistake 100 years prior. I mean, some of the synchronicity was really eerie, really remarkable. It's not much fun, actually, crossing South Georgia in the old gear either. You have your leather boots, you've got your nails through, you've got your carpenter's adze, you've got your length of rope, about 40 yards. You try as best you can to separate yourself out on the rope. Barry and I alternated going first each. We kept Paul in the middle as the non-climber, and we walked off into zero visibility. The first time we saw the Trident Mountains, which is where Shackleton famously slid on the coiled rope 1,500 feet down from the plateau down to the glaciers below, was when we were this distance away. The first one of them just appeared out of the mist. You can see it there. And then there's another 2 here, and the 4th one you can just about see there, and this is Barry. We got to the top of that pass that Shackleton had slid down. Darkness was coming behind him and bad weather, and he made that decision to slide down over whatever was there. As I say, no maps. This is very steep, by the way. And, you know, I stood at the top of that, and I've read the story 100 times, but you're standing there and you're amazed at the bravery and the instantaneous decision-making to make the judgment to actually slide down that thing. In some respects, you know, if you're a non-climber and you haven't got good gear and you're tired and you're trying to get down quickly, actually sliding is the best thing. If you walk down or try and climb down and you stumble and you tumble and you rope to the other guys, everybody goes, unless they're in a position to really hold you. So sometimes sliding and actually controlling your descent by going your backside is probably not a bad thing to do. For us, there was a massive crevasse, only about 150 yards down. So it seemed no point, for the sake of historical accuracy, killing ourselves by going into that. So we chose not to. And we went down, maneuvered past that, climbed down to within about 400 yards of the bottom, and thought, for the sake of it, let's try and see what happens. It was a hell of a ride, even from 400 yards, knowing what was there. But to go from the top, you just immediately had a feel for the measure of the man that Shackleton was, to have thought about doing that. The journey across South Georgia is glaciers. He crossed 3. We only had to cross 2. The other one has melted because of the climate change that is ravaging South Georgia. The British Antarctic Survey have studied this place to death. 92% of the glaciers are in retreat in South Georgia. Plenty of snow continuing to fall in the interior, which is what supplies glaciers, but there's so much melting going at the front that they are retreating up the valleys. The third glacier for us was a lake. We had to work out a way of actually getting around the lake. We had to just wade through it in the end. But these glaciers are big and very difficult to cross when you've got such poor equipment. All these shots are taken when the visibility is good, by the way. We had to travel regardless. Just no point showing you a presentation with a bunch of white slides. So I've showed you the ones where the screen is clear. But we fell in about 20 times between the three of us. Not all the way, knee, waist, sometimes in over the head, sometimes a little bit further. Always roped together. There's the carpenter's ads I've got. And it is a really challenging environment through which to try and travel. The first glacier, all the crevasses were quite clear. The second one was like cotton wool, couldn't see anything and just kept falling through, one time after another. We finally got to the last line of mountains. Great Wind Ridge, Shackleton called it back in the day. And if you read his account, he talks about lying on his back and going down a steep couloir. And he lay on his back because all of the nails had snapped off his boots during the course of the crossing, going through the ice and the rocks. The only ones he had left were on the heels. So he dug them in, and he was looking through his feet at the abyss below. And he talks of dislodging pebbles and bits of ice and it just spinning off into the abyss below. I've read that many times. That's the kind of stuff that makes you scared in the middle of the night when you say you're going to do this thing. And you hope when you get there that there was a bit of embellishment. Unfortunately not. You get there and that's precisely the condition in which you find yourself. If you really do go down the steep terrain of Great Wind Ridge, as we believe he did, we followed the route that we believe he did, which is very steep, uncompromising, snow, ice and rock climbing down steep chutes, right direct off Great Wind Ridge. These days, quite a few groups who've attempted this go around a glacier to the side, which is quite gentle. That's not what he describes in his book. We got down to about 1,000 feet. By the time we got to the valley floor below, we were exhausted, to be honest. Then we had to wade the glacier lake and make our way to the point where Shackleton would have first heard the siren all those years before. Finally, after 96 hours, we reached Stromness whaling station. Shackleton got there in 36 hours. I'm in a perfect position here where we've done what we can. We've got as close as we could to doing what he did, and in inverted commas succeeded, but we've done so not at the expense of the Shackleton legend. There's still some things that amaze me, having even done what we did, as to how he managed to do it. We didn't sink a ship, we didn't lose the dream of crossing Antarctica, we didn't have the terrible financial and reputational damage associated with the ship going down and not making it. We didn't leave the men on Elephant Island. People knew where we were. You can't do what he did, but we got as close as you can. And even working as hard as we could, with maps, still took 96 hours to his 36. When he, Worsley and Crean reached the whaling station, they, were amazed to have made it after 18 months, 20 months out there. Both Worsley and Crean independently came up to Shackleton afterwards, and they used to call him boss. They said, look, boss, this is going to sound a little bit odd, but I was convinced we were there with somebody else. And Shackleton said, so was I. They were convinced that they were there with another, that they did it with 4 and not 3. Anyway, I'll let you draw your own conclusions, but suffice to say, they really felt that that was the case at the time. And I really can't account for the difference in our times. A certain amount to do with evacuating those guys, but not all of it. Really a remarkable thing. To finish, I think I get asked 3 questions more than any other, perhaps. One is, how do you go to the toilet at South Pole? The answer is quickly. The second one is, are the ice caps melting? The answer is, eastern part of Antarctica, which is 90% of the ice, seems to be in a state of very uneasy equilibrium. More snow falling in the interior because more water is being sucked out of the sea and dumped in the interior as snow. But the glaciers are moving more quickly, carving off ice more quickly, and it seems it's a judgment call as to which way that's going to go. Will there end up being far more ice loss than the amount of additional snow falling or not? We don't know. The western part, where all these events took place, is melting very, very quickly. Sadly, we've had 3 degrees Celsius of sea level rise in about the last 60 years in the western part of Antarctica. This is a very, very serious problem. And the last one is why? Why do it? I do it, originally it was a physical challenge. I've been doing these for 25 years, these expeditions. It was a case of just seeing what I could put myself through, seeing whether I'd come out the other side. Now I do it really more to reacquaint myself with the more resourceful part of myself that seems to emerge when I put myself in these difficult positions. And you go back down to Antarctica without sounding corny to kind of rediscover yourself. Everyday life doesn't bring it out, and I'm sure there are many here who can identify with that kind of sentiment. And the other thing is I do it because I'm an environmental scientist, and let's face it, if you talk about climate change, no one's going to listen to you talk about the ocean or climate change if you're a 40-something environmental scientist. But if you're a guy who's done polar expeditions, and you can come out with a few half-decent lessons around teamwork and leadership, you can get in front of politicians in the corporate sector, and you do your standard talk, and then when you're all friends, someone says to you, is this thing real, this climate change thing? And you say, well, as a matter of fact, it is. And you have some degree of trust in them, and you try and use your polar expeditions as a Trojan horse for your environment messages. Basically, I'll leave it at that. But look, the final comment I'll say, a journalist came up to me about a year ago now and said, what's the difference between your expedition and Shackleton's? And I think he was trying to insinuate that we cheated or done something differently. And I said, you know, the key thing is Shackleton was trying to save all his men from the Antarctic, and I'm now more concerned about saving Antarctica from man. That's what's changed. Thank you. Edmund Hillary.
Edmund Hillary. Edmund Hillary.
Very deeply honoured to be in your presence, I must say. You've changed a bit since I last saw you, but anyway, beard's looking good. The plenty of trench foot, which is a kind of cold weather injury that's caused by very cramped conditions, wet, lack of moving. Many of us had pre-existing frostbite injuries. I've got plenty. I can't feel toes on my right foot and things like that. Nerve damage through frostbite. But from this expedition, no, we didn't.
Okay, do you see the next one on your panel?
Decadillac. Is that right?
Up here? Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
So I was just curious, as a blue water sailor, your freeboard was how many inches above the water?
Oh, it varied. Foot and a half.
Foot and a half, and I was on a 46-foot boat which had 6.5 foot of freeboard and similar conditions. I don't know how you guys, I know quienes más macho in terms of I could never have done that. But did you also have modern safety gear? Did you have EPIRBs? Did you have any way of communicating in case things got sideways?
Yes, but we did. You're right. We had an AIS for a start, which is a sort of tracking device that tells other people that you are there. It tells them that you are a small 23-foot boat with 6 men on board, and you know, for God's sake, if you're in trouble, don't expect us to rescue you, essentially. But no, you need that so that other shipping can avoid you. We did have EPIRBs, but reality is, unless there's somebody who's in a position to then come and track where you are and pluck you out of the water using the information from that EPIRB, there's not much use, you know. And the vessel that brought the Discovery Channel guys down essentially towed us to Elephant Island, got some footage of us, left, and rejoined us back at South Georgia at the end. And much of the footage we shot, this was a very serious element of this. We didn't want a kind of nanny boat 500 yards from us the whole time, because otherwise there's no point doing this thing. They've got to push off and leave you alone to your own devices. Theoretically, they were our backup. Trouble is, in a motor yacht, which is what they were, their maximum speed in, say, rough seas, with the seas with them, would be maybe 5.5, 6 knots, perhaps 7 on a good day. And if they're, 50 nautical miles away and you fall in the water with your EPIRB on, great. It may as well be my mother coming to try and get you. There's no possibility of a rescue in that situation. So, look, we tried to keep it as real as possible, in that the risks had to be real. If you're starting to contrive and cheat, then no point. But we wanted to do it with some degree of responsibility. That boat could have come in and picked up the pieces of the remaining guys on the boat, but I think if you fell overboard, that was it. Gene Krantz.
Good morning. Thank you for the brilliant talk and a brilliant effort. Surely there must have been a leadership challenge on this voyage. Obviously, that's one of the things that we think most highly of Sir Ernest for, was his ability to handle those challenges. Can you describe for us, during that voyage, when it seemed like everything was going wrong, the water was coming in, you were upside down perhaps, whatever, what was the biggest leadership challenge moment, and how did you manage it? And also, who managed it? Was it you, or was it somebody else? Who emerged as a true leader? I guess there's 3 questions there, if you don't mind.
Yes, there's a lot of information contained therein. I'd like to think that, I'm not Shackleton, but I like to think that I set a positive example for people to follow. I will, undertake, the riskiest of challenges just like the other guys. It was a completely horizontal kind of management structure, if you like, on board this boat. There's no point micromanaging people with the kind of expertise that this team had. You've got to be in a position to bring out the best in those people. There's no point arbitrarily having a chain of command that requires, Seb to speak to Nick to speak to Baz to speak to Tim and say, what do we do about the fact that the boat's just tipped upside down? You need to have an instantaneous decision-making made by those teams. So I think the answer to your question is you empower those people to make decisions when circumstances demand it. If there's a situation in which, as there was with us, where perhaps the most challenging moment actually was arriving at South Georgia, where suddenly the pressure that has sustained you and kept you all focused as a completely unified team, i.e. the Southern Ocean, is now removed from the equation, you've suddenly got 6 guys saying, I don't know, in my judgment, I wouldn't attempt to cross South Georgia in this weather. We were there for 5 days, by the way, hunkered down on the beach in what were essentially very miserable conditions, you can probably appreciate. That was probably the most difficult moment for me. Everybody had thought, we're not going to make South Georgia, surely. In our hearts, did we really feel we could do this, that Shackleton had done? We all publicly maintained the facade that we thought we would do it, but having arrived there, we all let our guard down, and suddenly you have to reboot the system with a view, you're not there yet. You've still got Stromness. If Shackleton had just got to South Georgia, he would have died, and so would all the people left behind. So I think that's when I had to put my foot down and say, look, guys, there were a few dissenting voices when we got there, being very respectful of the other guys with whom I'm still great friends. But I think then, an executive decision had to be made. And it was made between myself and Barry Gray, who was a fantastic mountaineer. And we said, look, day 5, midnight, we're going, with a view to getting to the most dangerous terrain that you need to be able to see by dawn, which is about 5 or 6 hours climbing away from where we were. The first bit's easy, it's just a steep slope. Then you're in amongst crevasses and things like that. That's what I had to say, we're going. And there were some dissenting voices. And I said, well, this is what we signed up for, this is what we're doing. So it was a combination of things. Harkoof I've got, followed by James Cook.
Did you at some point thought of quitting?
Yes.
and how did you keep going?
Well, when you're in a small boat in the Southern Ocean, you've got no choice. And that is an element of expeditioning. I think you deliberately, if you know there are certain times when you're going to have moments of weakness and you know yourself well enough to maybe anticipate when they might be, you've got to put in place things that keep you committed to the cause almost. You know, certainly in the planning of an expedition, if you're feeling that you're not going to be able to keep going with the exhausting schedule, this hasn't changed in 100 years, by the way, of trying to raise funds, trying to keep it all together. The best thing to do to keep yourself committed is to say to everyone, we're doing this thing. And then reputationally, you're just obligated to do it. And you use it against yourself to keep yourself going. When you're in the Southern Ocean, look, being in a boat with a bunch of other high-profile sort of performers, you know, high-performing guys, no one's going to be the first one to throw in the towel. But there were moments when it was extremely challenging, as you can appreciate. I think self-delusion is a very useful skill in expeditions. Everyone sits around pretending everything's fine when you're in a huge storm. But I think, you know, you have your own internal reasons, you have the team around you, and you, by endurance we conquer. You keep going. These are difficult questions to answer. I'm happy to discuss it with you further afterwards. You don't seem satisfied with that answer, but that's okay. Okay, next one. James Cook.
Hello. Hi. What is the critical next step for the protection of Antarctica from man?
Glad these are small questions. It's
You're in the UN.
Yeah, I'm in the UN. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Namibia. Thank you very much. That's your funding cut. No, actually, I'm more worried about the Arctic, to be honest. I mean, Antarctica is a global common. In other words, there's never been a human population there, so no one's ever divided it up and said, well, that used to be our bit historically, so because our ancestors were there, we reserve the right to take oil from it or whatever. And so the fact there's never had a human population gives it a certain degree of, the treaty a certain degree of strength. So actually the Antarctic Treaty is reasonably good. In fact, there are many who hold it up as an example of global cooperation as to how we could deal with issues. Nevertheless, we do have, you know, krill being harvested and illegal fishing and those sorts of activities. I think the biggest challenge to Antarctica is not in Antarctica, it's climate change. And you can put in place all the legislation you want to protect Antarctica, but the problems will be transboundary in nature and caused everywhere else in the cities of the world and that sort of thing. So the climate change talks coming up in Paris end of this year, that's the best way to protect Antarctica. The Arctic is a basket case. You know, it really is. You've got an ocean, you have counterclaims to that ocean, you have many people using the ocean as a route to Asia from Europe and the US. Used to be Northwest Passage, then it was Northeast Passage, and now actually you can go straight through with icebreakers straight through the North Pole. Why not? It's shorter. And if the economics stack up, why not do it? And you have 5 countries with Arctic coastline, beachfront real estate, if you like, and then you've got a bunch of others who have Arctic territory because they have land north of the Arctic Circle. You have all of the indigenous groups who quite rightly have a big say in things, and it's a mess. How are we going to protect the Arctic is what I'm most concerned about, actually, perhaps even more so than Antarctica. Toshio Manash I have next on my list. You might have to remind yourself who you are.
Do you think if your team had a chance to quit, they would quit?
That's a very good question as well. Look, when the person before said, would you quit, and it's in your mind, but you never really seriously consider it. And I can't speak for all the other guys, but I think they all felt the same way. None of us seriously thought we would. We all were intent on doing justice to ourselves and repaying the confidence that everyone had shown in us, not least of all Alexandra Shackleton, in asking us to do this. So I don't think we would have quit.
There's a question up front. I don't know if you...
Question up front, yes. Yes.
In 1993, I interviewed. Hear me now? Does that work? In 1993, I interviewed about 500 people to crew for me on a transatlantic race, including Helena Darvelid and Paul Larson. And I was wondering how you went about deciding on a proper crew for this. It was very difficult for me. What you looked for?
Yes, that's a very good question. How did you recruit the team? I mean, we did go through the formal process of putting the word out there amongst various channels, the Royal Geographical Society and that sort of thing. I think the way the team honestly came together was that people started to hear of the project through word of mouth and came to me and said, look, can I manage a particular aspect of this thing that I think I'm well suited to manage? And you know, if you feel that my performance has been good, I'm prepared to continue to be involved at no cost to you. And you know, if you feel that I'm good enough, then at the end, I kind of get a place on the team. I guess we got people to commit in the knowledge they may not be in the final team, and you can then almost see how those people perform. You know, these are high-profile people. Paul came number 2 in the World Sailor of the Year Awards, the Rolex Awards last year. You know, he's no slouch. And the fact that he was prepared to give his time at no cost, really in the knowledge he may not even be in the final crew, it said something about him. And I almost use that as a measure of their level of commitment to the cause. So it was one of those sort of, there is no easy answer to that. In terms of the skills, you want people who have a kind of niche set of skills, but you also want them to have the capacity for lateral thought. I think Malcolm Gladwell, the New York Times writer, he said there's 2 types of intelligence. He says there's the convergent thinker who processes a lot of information and can sort out sequential problems better than anyone else. They've got computing power upstairs. But the trouble is problems don't manifest in a sequential way often. There's a problem that appears in front of you, it's a roadblock. You have to think divergently to get around that. So you need not only niche skills, but you need divergent thinking, lateral thinking to help you get through. So I think I picked both. Good sense of humor was important in all this. You know, Larson's quite funny sometimes. Jacques Cousteau. I've never had a question from Jacques Cousteau, so.
First of all, an astonishing undertaking, and not having read the book yet, but seen the film, so engaging and well done. Thank you for doing it. What questions came out of this expedition for you that you'd like to find out answers for?
Well, that is a very good question. These are very good questions. I suppose I am fascinated by that discrepancy in time between what we did and what Sir Ernest and his men did all those years before. I'm not a traditionally, denominationally religious person, but I must admit there are some interesting questions around what accounted for the difference. I mean, we got bogged down for about 30 hours probably with the extraction of those guys, but we didn't. That doesn't account for the whole difference. So there's something in that for me. And you know, I suppose now I'm interested in trying to apply some of his leadership to some of the real problems that we're faced with globally. I don't want to just be celebrating. Next year is the actual 100th anniversary of this boat journey. I don't want to be celebrating all the leadership he stood for, which is to get everybody pulling in the same direction to achieve this insurmountable goal, breaking it down into small pieces. I don't want all of that leadership just to be used in the abstract. I'd like to try and apply it to something like climate change and say, look, you know, we've got a huge problem. How can we get all these different players to pull in the same direction, maybe using some of Shackleton's thinking to get us there? So I'd like to keep the legacy alive rather than just retelling the story as a good story. But it's that difference in the timing that I think is a very interesting thing. We were very lucky to meet Alexandra Shackleton at his grave on the day after his birthday. I mean, this is an amazing bit of coincidence that we should get there at that time. We actually left South America on the anniversary of his death, not through design. We were intended to leave the week prior. Delays held us up, that sort of stuff. And then we finished on his birthday. We actually finished the expedition on his birthday. So there's a really nice bits of synchronicity in there. Vitus Bering, we have.
Thank you. Quick question. You are an environmental scientist. You're very recognized in the world for what you do. You talked about climate change very effectively. Is anybody listening to what you are saying?
That's another very good question. I think we have an opportunity at the climate change talks in Paris at the end of this year to really make a difference. I don't want this to turn into a political thing here at the UN, but it's very tempting, isn't it? Because it feels right to do so. The assembled nations of the world, we must act. But the answer is, I think people accept it's real now. In fact, the ones that I'm most ashamed of, frankly, are Australia, where I live, where we're going backwards, and there's nothing clever about being, taking the position we take, frankly. I think most of us are now accepting of the fact that it's real, so I don't tend to go to talks and have people stand up and go, look, it's all hogwash, it doesn't exist. That doesn't happen as much as it used to. I think what people are now trying to say is, what do we need to do? It's not whether it's real, it's what do we need to do, is the question I'm hearing. And I think the danger is that we've gone from a state of where people were in denial to where people are now in a state of despondency. And both of those are not good mindsets to be in. Denial is obviously not good, but despondency isn't much good either. If people think, wow, it's so big, I don't actually know what to do to make my contribution to solving this thing. There are many, many things we can do. A decent climate agreement in Paris would be a very, very good start. Where people invest their superannuation, their pension. In Australia, we have $1.4 trillion, the fourth biggest pension pot after the US, Germany, and the UK in pensions. And if we invested that accountably, we'd be going a long way to making a difference. In contrast, at the climate change talks last year, the total pot for dealing with green issues is $10 billion. That's 110 times less than what the US budget deficit was for this financial year to keep the government services going. So I ask you, are we dealing with it? Like I say, it's becoming political. I'm going to stop. But there are many things that we can do, and as individuals too. William Clark.
Great. Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much for doing this. And thank you to Alexandra Shackleton as well. This is quite a tribute to the man Shackleton himself, and quite a journey. And I'm curious about the food. How often did you all eat, and what were your portions? Because I know I get grumpy when I get hungry. And then were you able to have a proper meal when you got to the beach with the Discovery crew as well?
Again, very good questions. We are bigger than they were then. We took roughly the same amount of food. On my Mawson expedition, it was all about working out whether he could survive on 2,100 calories a day, which is a very, very careful analysis of what he took. And then instead of eating dogs, I took kangaroo meat with exactly the same protein, fat, and carbohydrate levels. Did it to the calorie every day. That's about 6 Mars bars, by the way, of calories a day on that one. This one, the issue wasn't so much the food, it was really surviving the boat journey in a very unseaworthy boat, the clothing, and indeed the water, the lack of water. That was as much the problem as anything. We got the food as close as we could. We ate pemmican, we ate the kind of nougat stuff. We drank sugary tea and, that kind of thing. We had whiskey, which was very nice, supplied by our sponsor, who I won't mention. Okay, McKinley's. Anyway, lovely stuff. We are bigger men than they were then, so this was a problem for us. We got to day 3 before we had anything to eat because we all felt so sick. And Barry Gray said, look, I don't care how rough it is, I'm just getting the stove going and we're going to eat anyway. And it was just as well he did, because I think morale and decision-making ability was starting to deteriorate. Me being amongst the worst, I felt very, very weak, being the biggest. But Tom Crean was the same size, the biggest man on Shackleton's expedition. He was the same size as our smallest man, Nick Bubb, just to give you an idea. Jane Goodall.
Can you tell me a little bit about your clothing? I know it's not really off the rack these days, and I'm wondering if there's some interesting people out there who made it for you.
Well, the original stuff was Burberry. Burberry these days make, tartan-lined trench coats and handbags, and they're very expensive, and they're very good clothes. But back in the old days, they were the Gore-Tex of the period, dry, lightweight, breathable, allegedly waterproof. But I think it's fair to say they're not really designed for open ocean sailing. We didn't use Burberry, actually. We used exactly the same gabardine fabric, but we made it ourselves to the specification of the original stuff, under which we wore woolens, and then we had leather military boots. And each man sort of chose his own period boots. In fact, I reused my ones from my Mawson expedition because they were well worn in. And all hopeless, when you're standing in water. But there were no clever fixes. There was no neoprene or thermals or waterproofing layers or anything hidden under our clothing. It was just as he had, and made it very challenging. William Bligh.
Hello. Beyond the time delta that you've cited between you and the original Shackleton group, what else surprised you along the way?
Well, I think he had it worse than we did. I think that was the thing that really surprised me most, is the extent to which we were pushed as a team who knew what was coming, had trained specifically for this. If I can say so, certainly about my colleagues anyway, being good, top leaders in their game, and how difficult we found it to keep things together, only being subjected to what we were subjected to. And as I say, we didn't lose a ship. Shackleton had invested a lot reputationally and financially in that ship. He'd lost the dream of crossing Antarctica. He'd left the men behind. No one knew where they were. I mean, there were just a whole range of things that make his journey more difficult than it was for us. I think the big thing for me was just how close it was for us to do just the bit that we did. And without sounding kind of corny about it, I mean, I think you come out of the back of this and you just feel an even greater sense of respect for Shackleton than you did when you went in. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the main observation for me coming from this.
Thank you.
Reinhold Messner.
Going back to the time, to the time difference, the 36 hours and the 96 hours. If I remember correctly, my namesake, Mr. Messner, and Conrad Anker, and a third climber, a British chap whose name escapes me, a few years ago did the same crossing, but with modern mountaineering gear, and it took them a lot longer than it took Shackleton also. Do you remember that? Is my memory?
Yeah, Stephen Venables was the other guy.
Right, correct.
He's no slouch either. I mean, these are all better mountaineers than me. So Messner also broke his ankle on that trip, but continued on as only he could, yeah, I mean, it is remarkable. I mean, what I would say is that Shackleton took lots of risks. He was actually someone who was very careful about taking risks that he didn't think were worthwhile. He was actually almost cautious in certain situations, his primary goal being to keep everybody intact. So when you get to the top of the Trident mountains and you look down at the couloirs that they went down and you think, wow, he must have, the conditions must have been bad coming in behind them for him to just think, right, we just got to do this. But most of us climb down that rather than sit on our backsides and slide, and therein lies, a saving of quite a few hours if you're prepared to do it. So I think the answer is he just took some big risks to account for some of that time anyway. Mike Massimino.
At the time of your journey?
Well, I'm now, I was 46 when I did it. Shackleton was 41, I believe. I better consult. He was born in 1874. Yes, he was, yeah, is that right? 42. He was 42. I was 46. The thing that always amazes me about many of those heroic era explorers is how young they were, generally speaking. Of course, Shackleton had done things prior. And, you know, if you look at Shackleton and Mawson's team, there were many guys in their 20s without the benefit of all the subsequent learning and knowledge that we have. So a 20-something person going down there now has this tremendous wealth of information to rely on that they just simply wouldn't have had. They were relying on making their own judgments in a place that very few had, if any, had been to, so it was remarkable. I must admit, I'm glad my path with Shackleton is diverging now, because for a while there, the level of financial stress and everything else was pretty similar. We were the same age. He died at 47, and I'm glad to say I'm now 48, so I think I've just got past. Zhang Qian.
Yes. Speaking of relative premature death, I often wondered, reading some of the Shackleton exploits, if the early polar explorers that ate this pemmican day in and day out, in fact, has anybody ever done a study of the heart disease associated with polar explorers, the early polar explorers, and what was your cholesterol reading when you got back?
Yes, the answer is I don't know. I mean, I suppose Shackleton did die at 47. I mean, I think a lot of the stresses and he had heart trouble, but I doubt the diet helped. All the smoking, yes. I might let Alexandra talk to that one, but I did do some medical analysis as part of my Mawson trip, but it was just me and one other guy, and the sample size was too small for that to be publishable. But we lost a lot of weight. We did all sorts of stuff on bone density and cholesterol and kidney function and that sort of thing. But this time we didn't do that.
When after my grandfather died, the ship's doctor had the horrible task of post-morting a friend, and he found he had long-standing atheroma. He had it for years. He always refused to be examined, which the leader of the expedition can. When he was in Rio, before leaving, he suffered an attack of what he called suppressed flu, a disease, I believe, unknown to the medical society.
Ed Vistas.
Is there any life on Elephant Island?
What was that first bit? Sorry?
Is there any life on Elephant Island?
There's plenty of elephant seals and penguins and a few silly people like us, occasionally. Temporarily, yeah. No other people, though.
Okay, maybe two more questions.
Thomas Mitchell.
Yes, I've been to South Georgia and Stromness on numerous occasions, and during the time when you still could walk around the buildings, you could walk up to the manager's villa, and in there is a bathtub, and I wonder if you can confirm for me if that was the same bathtub that the boss used to clean up after he came over.
I can't confirm that because we weren't allowed in. We could only go to within a 100-yard perimeter of Stromness because of the asbestos and the structural integrity of the buildings. So I can't confirm it, sorry.
This was many years ago, but there's still a black line around the bathtub there.
I can imagine, yeah.
Okay, last question. Who do you have?
William Dampier.
Hi. First of all, I just want to say that I wish that the real UN would work as amicably and cohesively as everyone here today. I guess my question would be, Do you have any further expeditions planned in the future?
Yes, I'm going to be climbing through the mountains that still have glaciers at the equator to highlight the amount of melting that's occurred, and I'll be doing that simultaneous with the climate change talks at Paris at the end of this year. I'm doing it together with WWF, not the Worldwide Wrestling, by the way, the other one. As much as people want to see me up there in a leotard, I'm definitely not going to do it. Maybe in time, yeah. So it will be with WWF, and we hope we can make a real statement about the importance of some definite action. I feel that there is a real groundswell of international opinion to want to do something about climate change at this Paris summit at the end of this year. That's 30th November to the 11th of December. But we will see. We've been there 20 times before. This is the 21st meeting, so let's hope we can take a leaf out of Shackleton's book and show a bit of leadership.
Thank you, Tim, very much. Thank you, Tim.